Hello, my name's Pandora Pound. I'm going to be talking about how to break the lock into animal research within academia. I'm from the Safer Medicines Trust in the UK, which is a patient safety charity that aims to make medicine safer by facilitating a transition to human relevant drug development. So the context is that animal research has failed to reduce human suffering, so there's huge unmet need in terms of chronic illness and diseases, for which there aren't enough treatments, and that there is also a failure to safeguard humans. So many medicines tested on animals go on to cause adverse drug reactions, hospitalization, and patient misery, as well as economic loss. At the same time, there's increasing unease about the use of animals in research and a flourishing of new methodologies that are able to, will have the potential to advance medicine without using animals. So even though there's limitations of animal research and there's these pressures to replace animal research and the availability of methodologies to replace animal research is proving incredibly difficult to break lock-in to animal research and to get NAMs adopted. So I'm going to be talking today about how to try and break lock-in within academia specifically. I'm going to talk about what lock-in is, how animal research became locked in, and then suggest some ideas about how we might break lock-in. So lock-in is when technology becomes entrenched due to positive feedback loops, and this is regardless of whether it's considered to be worthwhile or not. So technological lock-in might be when there's an accumulation of data or experience or off-the-shelf methodologies that have built up over decades of animal use that make it easier to use animals rather than NAMs. And this paper from 2020 showed that the most common reason for choosing an animal model was the availability of that model and the availability of expertise in that model rather than its specific relevance to the question or to humans. So that's an example of lock-in. Institutionally, there's obviously key beneficiaries that want to protect their interests, so academics, universities, animal breeding institutions and so on. There's a massive infrastructure that supports the use of animals. There's funding streams, specific journals, career programs. And of course, academics who conform to discipline norms are going to find it easier to progress within the current context. They're going to be able to publish in high impact journals more easily and gain funding, which in turn will put them in positions of relative power, enabling them to then perpetuate the norms of their discipline. Psychologically, well, everyone wants to believe that the work they're doing is worthwhile, and animal researchers believe that their work is morally justified, and their training enculturates this belief. It also becomes entrenched due to continually having to defend it against its opposition. And of course, there are organisations specifically dedicated to ensuring the continuation of animal research, such as this one in the UK, Understanding Animal Research. So how did it happen? Well, animal research as we know it, has it in the West anyway, has its roots in the 19th century with physiologist Claude Bernard, whose aim was to place physiology on as firm a scientific footing as chemistry and physics were at the time. And he believed that biomedical science should be conducted in the laboratory and not at the patient's bedside, which is where it was at the time. He believed in testable hypotheses. He believed that animal experiments were relevant to humans, and that species differences are differences of degree only, so that they are quantitative differences rather than qualitative. And he believed that these differences could be accommodated using scaling formula. He also rejected evolutionary theory, which was emerging at the time. He felt it was a little too speculative, it wasn't supported by experimental evidence, and he was of the view that different animals didn't so much belong to different species, but were the same animal, but just dressed up differently. And I would argue that animal research is still very much under Bernard's influence, particularly with somewhat a disregard for evolutionary medicine, evolutionary biology. So animal experiments serve to create distance from the patient's bedside, made biomedicine seem more scientific. Animal experiments themselves acquired a scientific veneer, partly through the use of statistics and experimental groups and so on. So it came to be seen as a robust scientific approach, proper science, as opposed to how medicine used to be conducted before the patient's bedside. Now, because of this equation with science and proper science, other academics were reluctant to criticize or challenge the practice because they didn't want to be labeled as unscientific. And I think that still carries on today. I definitely observed that in my couple of decades working within universities. It was almost taboo, really, for other academics to challenge academic animal researchers. So lacking challenge from their fellow academics, those conducting animal research have really had free rein within their universities, I would suggest, and little challenge. And the specific nature of animal research creates insularity, it creates silos, this ivory tower idea. And added to this, the history of animal research and the secrecy involved means that access to laboratories and information is very tightly controlled, even within universities. There's a lack of collaboration across disciplines. So there's little exposure to any external influences and ideas, and this makes it really difficult for outsiders to reach or influence or challenge academics to just, to have some dialogue with them. Perhaps surprisingly, universities can be very unreceptive to change. And many animal researchers within academia don't perceive that there's really a need for NAMs. They don't think there's anything wrong with animal research, or if they do, they think that these problems are relatively easy to resolve. So how to break lock-in? I think it's very important to emphasize species differences, because a failure to translate to humans is a significant anomaly for preclinical animal research. And Thomas Kuhn, who wrote this wonderful book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions in the 60s, observed that when faced with anomalies within a paradigm, scientists tend to modify the theory to eliminate conflict rather than ditch the paradigm. But he observed that anomalies have to reveal real inadequacy to provoke radical change in a paradigm. And although we do have a reproducibility crisis within animal research, this is really regarded as quite superficial, something that can be resolved given enough time. Species differences are much more challenging to the paradigm because they're insurmountable. The use of humanized animals, genetically modified animals, hasn't increased translation rates. Todd Pruce, who's professor of pathology at Emory University School of Medicine in Atlanta, said a couple of years ago in a talk that you can find online, every lineage has undergone its own independent history of adaptation and specialization. Every species is special. That's why we call them species. It's the same root for the same reason. So this idea that a given species, and I think he was talking here about rats or mice, this idea that a given species is somehow representative of all other species is very difficult to rationalize based on modern evolutionary principles. So even if the quality issues were resolved within animal research, species differences would still make extrapolation to humans unreliable. And it's this issue that reveals the fundamental inadequacy in the paradigm. But it's insufficiently acknowledged to be a serious problem by those conducting animal research. And I think it's very important to highlight the tension between this mechanistic paradigm and a more sophisticated evolutionary theory. We need to highlight that ignoring species differences actually violates accepted basic biological principles and shows contempt, really, for evolutionary theory. So the role of NAMs. Thomas Kuhn observed that a paradigm will only be declared invalid if there's an alternative paradigm to take its place. And obviously we do have an alternative paradigm to take its place. He suggested that to be successful, this paradigm will need to solve problems that prompted the crisis in the old paradigm, and this is lack of predictivity to humans. He argued that this new paradigm will be particularly persuasive if it allows the prediction of unsuspected phenomena, so knowledge that wasn't possible to obtain within the old paradigm, something that's unexpected. And if NAMs are able to do this, then we really need to highlight these examples. They're very important. Of course, NAMs also have to be valid, robust, reproducible, and properly reported so that accusations that they aren't can't be used as ammunition against their use. We also really need to break down these silos, climb up the ivory towers. We need dialogue with animal researchers. We need to appeal to what animal researchers and NAMs developers may have in common, and at the very least, that would be a desire to advance human medicine. We need to attend animal research conferences. We need to network, open the channels of communication, thrash things out. We need to exchange views, organise friendly discussions, workshops, invite animal researchers to NAMS conferences, offer to give talks within universities, and we need to be imaginative. We need to take inspiration from things like the Dutch Helpathon, which is a really great way of getting animal researchers and NAMS developers together to try and resolve a specific problem. We need to also explore sticking points, for example, arguments about intact systems, which is often used as a particular argument for using animals. How can that be overcome using NAMs? It's also important to acknowledge that things are happening, albeit very slowly. We also need to acknowledge that the slow pace isn't surprising. Scientific revolutions do take time. The adoption of innovations definitely takes time, especially to begin with. And we need to acknowledge that animal research is in decline. So Imre Lakatos, who is a Hungarian philosopher of science, observed that research programs in decline are unable to extend themselves to new cases, so their only advances relate to existing problems. And we can really see that this is the case with animal research. It's not breaking new ground. It's playing catch up all the time. It's trying to solve its reproducibility problems, but it's not coming up with anything new or exciting, unlike NAMs. Of course, academics are completely ruled by funding, by what's available to fund their research. So it is, of course, vital to push to divert funding from animal research to NAMs. I'm not going to talk about this much because I know others will, and it's it's a clear and important point. But what I wanted to say that perhaps things are changing a little bit anyway, because most animal research is basic blue skies research. At least 53% of it is in the UK. But within funding, changes are happening, so it's becoming increasingly impact-based. So demonstrable impact is now a key goal for funders. This is what they're looking for in research, and this is what academics are being asked to demonstrate when they write funding applications. So this is potentially problematic for academics who might have been dominant in the past, because what they believe to be important is increasingly diverging from what funders believe to be important. And so it may be that blue skies research will become increasingly less fundable over time. So things are happening very slowly, but we obviously need to accelerate this process. So just to summarize, we need to emphasize the ability of NAMs to discover new phenomena that isn't or hasn't been predicted by animal research, and that's not possible to predict using animal research. We need to ensure that NAMs research and reporting practices are completely watertight as far as possible. We need to open the channels of communication. We need dialogue with academic animal researchers. We need to get into universities. We need to continue to push for a diversion of funding towards NAMs and away from animal research. And we really need to stress that animal research involves a rejection of evolutionary theory, which is completely unacceptable in the 21st century. Thank you.